As someone who was once foreign editor of Newsweek magazine and the editor-in-chief of the New York Times magazine, I guess you could say that I used to be a card-carrying member of the mainstream media. That was quite a long time ago, however. I left the Times in 1988, and it was a very different New York Times back then. It was under the executive editorship of a guy named Abe Rosenthal, who you may have heard of, A.M. Rosenthal. And when he hired me in 1977, he said, I have one rule, and one rule only, and that is, I want to keep this paper straight. I don't want it to be a left-wing paper. I don't want it to be a right-wing paper. I want it to be a truthful paper, and it was. It was a truthful paper, but then Abe left in 1987, and I left in 1988. The executive editorship of the paper went to a guy named Max Frankel, and then to Joseph Lelyveld, and on and on. And as we know, the paper today is about as far left-wing as you can get. To paraphrase Ronald Reagan, so I didn't leave the mainstream media left me. I called my book The Amateur, a reporter's book, because I did about 200 interviews for the book. I interviewed President and former members of the Obama administration, members of the White House press corps, Democrats and Republicans on Capitol Hill, African-American political leaders. A number of those African-American political leaders urged me to interview the Reverend Jeremiah Wright, Barack Obama's pastor for 23 years. And I told these African-American leaders, most of them in Chicago, by the way, that I would not feel comfortable sitting down with the Reverend Jeremiah Wright because of his rants against America, against white people, against Jews, against Israel. But they told me, you've got to go see the Reverend Jeremiah Wright because he's got a story to tell that's never been told before. So off I went to meet the Reverend Jeremiah Wright, who has an office in the Kwame Nkrumah Academy, which is named after the former Marxist dictator of Ghana. He's now retired from the Trinity United Church of Christ. And after I sat down with the Reverend Wright, I asked him if I could turn on the tape recorder, and he said yes. And so I have this little micro tape recorder. I turned it on, and for 3 hours we sat there and talked. I released the entire tape to the press, unedited, including some remarks of my own that were kind of a sucking up to the Reverend Wright in order to get him to talk. And I suppose you're not going to be surprised to hear that, except for Sean Hannity on Fox News Channel, not a single media outlet picked up any of that material from that 3-hour tape recording. They ignored it despite the fact that the Reverend Wright said a lot of very important things that had never been reported before. Things about Obama's Islamic past, things about the Reverend Wright being offered a $150,000 bribe by Barack Obama's closest friend, things about Obama himself secretly meeting with the Reverend Wright during the 2008 Democratic primary campaign, trying to shut him up. None of this has been reported before, and none of it has been reported in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, the Chicago Tribune, CBS, NBC, ABC, CNN. So what did I take away from this interview? I took away a portrait of the kind of man that we have in the White House. And that's what my book, The Amateur, is about. This is a man who sat at the knee of the Reverend Jeremiah Wright for 23 years, not just in his pew in the Trinity United Church of Christ, but in the Reverend Wright's home, hundreds of times, according to the Reverend Wright. And he listened to the Reverend Wright spin his Marxist theories of black liberation theology. This theology, to summarize it, simply says that there is an oppressor class, whites, and an oppressed class, blacks, and that America needs to redistribute wealth and power to even things out. Is it any surprise that I concluded in my book that President Obama is actually, in my view, in revolt against the values of the society he was elected to lead, which is why he has refused to embrace American exceptionalism, the idea that Americans are a special people with a special destiny, why he has railed against the capitalist system, demonized the wealthy, embraced the Occupy Wall Street movement. In fact, he's done many of the things that the Reverend Wright would applaud. In addition to being the most divisive and radical left-wing president we've ever had in our history, Obama is, in my view, an amateur. He is, at bottom, temperamentally unsuited for executive leadership, I concluded. He is something new in American society, an amateur in the White House, a president who is inept in the art of management and governance, who doesn't learn from his mistakes, and who therefore repeats them and makes our economy less robust and our nation less safe abroad. So it's that combination that I describe in The Amateur, a radical ideology and a bungling amateurism, a combination that I believe is a toxic mix. You know, I'm reminded of the difference between Barack Obama and Ronald Reagan, whose portrait you see around here at the Heritage Foundation. Two presidents who entered the White House during economic troubles with a very different vision of a way to get us out of our problems. Remember, at the end of the day, Ronald Reagan would pick up the telephone and call Tip O'Neill, the Democratic Speaker of the House of Representatives. These two guys had very little in common ideologically or politically. Reagan obviously dyed-in-the-wool conservative. Tip dyed-in-the-wool liberal. But he'd say to him, "Hey, Tip, why don't you come on over to the White House and have a drink?" And at the end of the day, Tip O'Neill would rise out of his speaker's chair, all 200 and whatever, 75 pounds of him. He'd go over to the White House. They'd open a bottle of whiskey. They'd have a drink. They'd tell jokes. They'd reminisce. Both of them loved to tell stories, as you know. Reagan told great stories. And they'd get to know each other. And then they'd get down to business. And Reagan would say something like this: "Tip, I'd like to get this bill passed. What's it going to take to get your boys to give me the votes?" And Tip would say, "Well, you know, Mr. President, there's a couple of things in that bill that I don't think I could get my guys to vote for. But if you change this a little bit and put this in a little," and Reagan said, "Well, you know, I think I could do some of that." And they'd work things out together. They do the business of America. Can you imagine Barack Obama having that kind of relationship with John Boehner, the current Speaker of the House? I can't. In fact, it took Barack Obama 2 years before he had his first meeting with John Boehner. By his very nature, Obama is unable to reach out beyond his tight inner circle of Chicago operatives in the White House to reach common cause with the Republicans on Capitol Hill. And I, for one, don't buy the mainstream media story that it's the Republicans who have blocked progress in Washington. In fact, my reporting proved just the opposite. I spoke to a top aide to the Republican House leadership, very close to Boehner and the other leaders on the Republican side. He told me, and I'm quoting now, every modern president, perhaps with the exception of Jerry Ford, entered the White House with a large quotient of self-assurance and arrogance. But what makes this president, Obama, unique is that he is so beyond that. This insider continued with his explanation. Not only is Obama self-assured, the smartest guy in the room, but in his estimation, all he has to do is to state something, and the scales will fall off your eyes. Despite the storyline people create that he is a thoughtful, non-ideological compromiser, he has a distinct leftist ideology and can't make a decision that takes him out of his comfort zone. To continue with what this man told me, he's got so little appreciation and knowledge of how Congress works that it's an equal branch of government. If you challenge him, he's furious. He gives you what we have come to call the death stare. He has no close relationships with any members of the Senate or the House, Democrats or Republicans. John Boehner says that in his 20 years in Washington, he's been through 4 administrations, and that this one is completely opaque. He doesn't know who makes the decisions there, how they make the decisions, and who is running the White House. The bottom line in my book, The Amateur, is that by all accounts, Barack Obama was elected for a job for which he has little relish. He doesn't find joy in being president, and like Richard Nixon and Jimmy Carter, he's an introvert who prefers his own company. He is someone who finds extended contact with groups of people outside his immediate circle to be actually draining, psychologically draining. He can rouse a stadium of, say, 20,000 people, but that audience is an impersonal monolith. Smaller group settings can be harder for him. Now, I interviewed a State Department guy who spent many hours in the Oval Office with the president. He told me while I was in the room, he'd get a phone call from a head of state or a head of government, foreign government, and I heard him say more than once, this is the president talking now to a foreign head of state or government, I can't believe that I've got to meet with all these congressmen from Podunk City to get my bills passed. Podunk City. And when the meeting was over, the State Department official said, there was no lingering, no schmoozing on the way out, there was no clinging to personal relationships like with Bill Clinton or Ronald Reagan. I heard the same complaint from people who raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for Obama during the 2008 election. I sat down for an hour and a half with a major Jewish donor in Chicago. He raised hundreds of millions of dollars for Barack Obama. I had my reporter's notebook out and I was scribbling my notes as he was talking about how great Obama was, how much he loved him, how much he had accomplished. And an hour and a half later, after I filled up pages of encomiums to Obama by this guy, I closed my notebook, put my pen back away, and got up to leave. He accompanied me to the elevator, and then suddenly he put his arm around my shoulder, and he said, you know something? I get complaints from Jewish American donors that they never hear from this guy. He's not like Bill Clinton, who used to call them and ask them about their wives and grandchildren and businesses and things like that. I turned to him and I said, well, how about you? He said, well, you know, I don't hear from him either. So what does all this say about a president who hates the day-to-day, give and take of politics, who doesn't have respect for members of Congress, who doesn't show loyalty to those who supported him with their money, time, and organizational skills? What does this say about a president who doesn't show any gratitude, who has frozen Oprah Winfrey out, of the White House who was frozen Carolyn Kennedy out of the White House, two very important women who helped get him elected. What does this say about a president who has ignored his African-American base to the point where every single African-American business person I spoke to told me that they were disappointed and disillusioned with this country's first black president? Friends, I think it speaks volumes about his character and his inflated self-image and his amateurism. Thank you very much.